Picture 3 archaeology labs on 3 different continents, working on 3 completely separate research projects. One team is carefully sequencing DNA from royal mummies in a desert necropolis. Another team is patiently analyzing skeletal remains pulled from a collapsed tomb complex thousands of miles away in a completely different climate, tied to an entirely different ruling dynasty altogether. A third team is carefully working through remains recovered from a royal burial site in yet another region entirely, studying a civilization whose language, religion, and political structure share almost nothing whatsoever in common with the other two. None of these teams set out looking for a connection between their projects. Each was simply trying to answer questions specific to their own empire, their own dynasty, their own unresolved historical puzzle. History books like to draw clean lines between civilizations. One empire rises here, another falls there, separated by oceans, mountains, centuries, entirely different gods and languages and systems of writing. It's a tidy way to teach history, a series of separate chapters that rarely bleed into each other. But ancient DNA doesn't care about tidy chapters. And when researchers began comparing royal remains recovered from 3 ancient empires that textbooks have always treated as almost completely unconnected, they found something that shouldn't have been possible if those civilizations really were as separate as we've always assumed. The same genetic signature, the same family line, showing up, generation after generation, inside the tombs of rulers who were supposedly building entirely independent, unrelated dynasties, thousands of miles and, in some cases, centuries apart. This is the story of what researchers are now quietly calling a hidden royal bloodline, one that appears to have threaded its way through the ruling families of 3 separate ancient powers, not through conquest or coincidence, but through careful, deliberate, generations-long intermarriage that never made it into any surviving written record at all. To understand how strange this discovery really is, you have to understand what these 3 empires looked like on paper before anyone thought to test the bones. Each one had developed its own creation myths, its own royal ideology, its own carefully constructed founding story explaining exactly why its ruling family, and only its ruling family, deserved to hold power. Officially, none of these 3 dynasties had any documented blood connection to each other at all. Diplomatic contact, trade, the occasional recorded marriage alliance between royal houses, sure, ancient empires were rarely as isolated from each other as popular imagination sometimes assumes, but a shared, continuous bloodline running quietly through all 3 ruling families, simultaneously. Nothing in the surviving written record so much as hints at that. The actual moment of discovery, according to researchers involved, happened almost by accident, the way a surprising number of major scientific breakthroughs tend to. A junior researcher working on a comparative genetics database, one designed to pool ancient DNA samples from multiple unrelated projects for broader statistical analysis, noticed an unusual repeated marker showing up in samples that, according to the database's own metadata, belonged to entirely separate research projects with no stated connection to each other. Assuming it was a labeling error or a database glitch, the researcher flagged it for review. It took weeks of careful, methodical checking, confirming sample origins, verifying laboratory protocols, ruling out contamination, before the team finally accepted what the data was actually telling them. This wasn't an error. The marker was real, and it was showing up exactly where it shouldn't have been possible to find it, which is exactly why the genetic results landed with such force when they finally came back from the lab. Researchers working across multiple excavation sites, each one associated with a different empire's royal tombs, had been independently collecting and sequencing ancient DNA for entirely separate research projects. Each team focused on their own empire's dynastic questions without any expectation of connection to the others. It was only when researchers began cross-referencing their data sets, comparing genetic markers across projects the way you might compare notes after independently solving pieces of the same puzzle, that the pattern became impossible to ignore. Specific, unusual genetic markers, rare enough that their repeated appearance couldn't reasonably be explained by chance, showed up in royal burials across all 3 sites. If the idea that 3 supposedly unconnected ancient empires might have secretly shared the same royal bloodline is the kind of mystery that grabs your attention, this is exactly the sort of discovery worth sticking around for. Go ahead and hit that like button now. It genuinely helps more people find stories exactly like this one. To understand why a shared marker across 3 unrelated sites is so statistically convincing, it helps to understand roughly how rare these specific genetic signatures actually are. Human populations carry enormous genetic diversity, and most individual markers, small variations scattered throughout the genome, are common enough that finding them in multiple unrelated people isn't surprising at all. But certain rarer combinations of markers, particularly ones tied to specific, uncommon mutations that arose relatively recently in a single ancestral line, occur infrequently enough that finding the exact same combination repeated across supposedly unconnected individuals becomes statistically remarkable. Researchers run these comparisons through rigorous probability calculations, essentially asking how likely it would be to see this exact pattern purely by chance, given everything known about how common or rare that specific genetic combination is across broader populations. When that probability comes back vanishingly small, as it did here, the alternative explanation that these individuals share genuine traceable ancestry becomes the far more statistically reasonable conclusion. Let's slow down and talk about what it actually means, scientifically, to identify a shared bloodline running through royal remains recovered from 3 separate archaeological sites. Ancient DNA carries specific genetic markers, distinctive patterns of variation that get passed down through families in predictable, traceable ways. When researchers find the same rare combination of markers showing up repeatedly across individuals who otherwise have no obvious connection, buried in different regions, sometimes separated by generations, that repetition becomes statistically significant. It stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like evidence of an actual continuous family line, one that somehow maintained itself across geography and time in a way official records never documented. Once researchers confirmed the pattern wasn't a fluke or sequencing error, the next question became obvious. How does an entire bloodline move quietly through 3 separate royal houses across multiple generations without leaving any trace in the written record at all? The most likely answer, based on the genetic evidence and the broader historical context surrounding these empires, points toward a sustained, deliberate pattern of strategic royal marriage, one carefully arranged, generation after generation, specifically to weave a single family's genetic legacy through multiple centers of power simultaneously, while keeping the details of exactly how and why quiet enough that court historians in each empire either never fully understood the pattern themselves or had strong political reasons to leave it out of their official chronicles entirely. It's also worth pausing on just how logistically demanding arranging marriages across 3 distant empires would have actually been in the ancient world, where travel across the relevant distances could take months. Communication depended entirely on trusted couriers, and any single miscommunication could unravel years of careful diplomatic groundwork. Moving a royal daughter or son from one empire's court to another wasn't a simple administrative matter. It required elaborate diplomatic negotiation, a significant material investment in dowries and escorts, and enough mutual trust between royal houses to risk exposing sensitive succession details to a foreign power. Sustaining that kind of exchange, quietly and repeatedly, across 3 separate empires and multiple generations, would have required an extraordinary and rarely acknowledged level of long-distance coordination, the kind of achievement that, under normal circumstances, would have been celebrated openly in royal inscriptions, rather than seemingly left out of the historical record almost entirely. That second possibility, deliberate concealment rather than simple historical oversight, deserves serious consideration because royal marriages in the ancient world were rarely random or purely romantic. They were calculated political tools, arranged specifically to create alliances, secure succession claims, or quietly extend one family's influence into a rival power's court. If a single extended family had, over several generations, managed to place its own daughters and sons into the royal households, a dynasty that appeared on the surface to be strengthening itself through prestigious foreign alliances might have actually been executing something considerably more ambitious and considerably more secretive. A long, patient strategy of embedding a shared bloodline across an entire region's centers of power, generation by careful generation. It's worth pausing here to really sit with how remarkable that strategy would have been if the genetic evidence is pointing towards something this deliberate. Coordinating royal marriages across 3 separate empires over multiple generations would have required patience measured not in years, but in decades, possibly centuries, along with a level of long-term political coordination that's genuinely difficult to imagine pulling off successfully without leaving some trace in the written record. And yet, here we are, with genetic evidence suggesting exactly that kind of coordination happened, while the written record stays almost entirely silent about it. That gap between what the bones say and what the inscriptions say is precisely what makes this discovery so compelling and, honestly, so unsettling to historians who have spent careers building their understanding of these 3 empires as fundamentally separate stories. If uncovering a hidden, multi-generational royal conspiracy is exactly the kind of ancient mystery you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because ancient DNA keeps turning up exactly this kind of quiet, patient historical secret the deeper researchers dig into royal burials around the world. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of how researchers built confidence in a claim this significant, because a discovery of this scale demands careful, skeptical verification before anyone treats it as settled fact. Comparing ancient genomes across independent research projects requires standardizing sequencing methods, contamination controls, and statistical analysis techniques across multiple labs that may have originally used slightly different protocols, a genuinely technical challenge in its own right. Researchers had to confirm that the shared genetic markers they were seeing weren't the result of some kind of systematic contamination affecting multiple labs in similar ways, a real risk whenever ancient DNA studies start comparing results across different research teams. Only after ruling out that possibility, through repeated independent testing and cross-laboratory verification, could researchers confidently say the shared genetic signature reflected a real ancient biological relationship rather than a modern laboratory artifact. Given how extraordinary this claim is, it's worth spending real time on exactly how skeptical the scientific community was before accepting it, because that skepticism is precisely what gives the eventual conclusion its weight. Extraordinary findings in ancient DNA research tend to attract intense scrutiny from other labs, specifically looking for reasons to doubt them, and this case was no exception. Independent research teams, unaffiliated with any of the original 3 projects, were invited to review the raw sequencing data, rerun the statistical comparisons themselves, and attempt to identify any alternative explanation that might account for the shared markers without requiring an actual biological connection. Proposed alternative explanations included the possibility of ancient, unrelated populations independently developing similar mutations through coincidence or contamination introduced during excavation or laboratory handling that might have cross-contaminated multiple projects using shared equipment or facilities. Each of these alternative explanations was tested directly against the data and one by one ruled out. It was only after this extended adversarial process of independent verification that the finding was considered solid enough to publish and defend publicly. Once that verification was complete, researchers turned to trying to reconstruct roughly when and how the shared bloodline might have first taken root. Comparing the degree of genetic similarity across individuals from all 3 sites allowed researchers to estimate, with reasonable statistical confidence, how many generations separated the earliest shared ancestor from the later individuals, showing the same markers. That analysis suggested the connection wasn't a single isolated marriage between 2 royal houses at some specific moment in time, but rather an ongoing pattern maintained and reinforced across multiple subsequent generations, exactly the kind of sustained, deliberate strategy that would have required careful coordination rather than a single lucky diplomatic match. This discovery also raises a genuinely fascinating question about power itself, one that goes beyond any single dynasty's ambitions. If a hidden bloodline really did thread its way through 3 separate empires simultaneously, what was that family actually trying to accomplish? Ancient empires didn't typically share power cooperatively. They competed, sometimes violently, for territory, resources, and prestige. A family capable of embedding itself into the royal households of 3 rival powers at once would have occupied a genuinely unique position, potentially capable of quietly influencing decisions, alliances, and successions across all 3 empires simultaneously, without any single empire fully realizing the extent of the connection. Whether that influence was ever actively used, whether this hidden dynasty was manipulating events behind the scenes, or simply maintaining a long-term insurance policy against any one empire's collapse, is something that genetic evidence alone can't answer. It reveals that the connection existed. It can't tell us exactly how, or whether, that connection was ever deliberately exploited. That distinction matters, and careful researchers are quick to draw it clearly. Genetic evidence is powerful precisely because it's difficult to fake or manipulate after the fact, unlike written records, which can always be edited, destroyed, or quietly rewritten by whoever holds power at any given moment. But genetics alone can't tell us motive. It can't tell us whether the shared bloodline represented a conscious, coordinated strategy pursued by ambitious individuals fully aware of what they were building, or whether it emerged more gradually, almost accidentally, through generations of ordinary diplomatic marriage that simply happened to concentrate within a single extended family without any grand master plan behind it at all. Both explanations remain genuinely possible, given the current evidence, and untangling which one is closer to the truth will likely require years of additional research, combining genetic data with careful re-examination of whatever fragmentary written records survive from all 3 empires. It's also worth acknowledging honestly that a discovery this dramatic invites overreach, and good historians resist that temptation even when the story practically begs for a more sensational conclusion. A shared genetic signature across 3 royal houses doesn't necessarily mean a single secret family was quietly running the ancient world from behind the scenes, coordinating a hidden empire, more powerful than any of its 3 visible counterparts. That's a compelling narrative, but it's considerably more dramatic than what the evidence directly supports. What the evidence actually shows is something quieter, and in some ways more interesting precisely because it's more believable, an extended royal family successfully embedding its bloodline across multiple centers of power. Over generations, likely through the ordinary mechanisms of diplomatic marriage, but doing so with enough consistency and reach that it left a genetic footprint no single empire's written records ever fully captured or explained. This discovery also fits into a broader pattern researchers keep encountering as ancient DNA research expands. Royal families across the ancient world were rarely as isolated from each other as their official histories like to present them. Diplomatic marriage between royal houses, even rival ones, was an extremely common tool for managing tension between competing powers, and modern genetic research keeps revealing just how extensive and how quietly durable those connections actually were. What makes this particular case unusual isn't that royal intermarriage happened. It's the scale, 3 separate empires, and the apparent duration, multiple sustained generations, suggesting a level of coordinated ongoing connection considerably beyond a single one-off alliance marriage, arranged to smooth over a temporary political tension. This discovery also forces a quiet reconsideration of how connected the ancient world actually was, well beyond just these 3 specific empires. Modern popular imagination often pictures ancient civilizations as largely self-contained bubbles, occasionally trading goods or fighting wars at their borders, but otherwise developing in isolation from one another. Archaeologists have known for a long time that this picture is oversimplified, that trade networks, diplomatic contact, and cultural exchange stretched much further and much more consistently across the ancient world than casual assumption tends to credit. But a shared royal bloodline running through 3 separate empires takes that interconnectedness to a considerably deeper level than trade goods or borrowed artistic styles ever could. It suggests these societies weren't just economically and culturally linked at the edges. At the very highest level of political power, their fates may have been quietly, deliberately intertwined, in ways nobody studying any single empire in isolation would ever have thought to look for. There's also something worth reflecting on here about how fragile our historical understanding of ancient political power actually is, even for civilizations we've studied for centuries. These 3 empires have each been extensively documented, translated, and taught in classrooms for generations, treated as separate, well-understood chapters of ancient history. And yet, a genetic connection this significant sat completely undetected. Hidden in plain sight inside royal tombs, archaeologists had already excavated, cataloged, and studied for decades, simply because the technology needed to reveal it didn't exist until very recently. It's a humbling reminder that even extensively studied history isn't necessarily fully understood history, and that entire hidden chapters can remain invisible for centuries, not because nobody was looking closely enough, but because the right tool to see them hadn't been invented yet. Researchers are already discussing what comes next, and the implications reach well beyond these 3 specific empires. If a connection this significant could hide undetected inside already excavated, already cataloged royal tombs for decades, simply waiting for the right cross-referencing technique to reveal it, it raises an obvious question about how many other supposedly separate ancient dynasties might share similar hidden connections nobody has thought to test for yet. Large-scale ancient DNA databases, pooling samples across many unrelated excavation projects, rather than keeping each digs. Genetic data isolated within its own research silo are still a relatively new tool in archaeology. This discovery is likely to accelerate exactly that kind of large-scale cross-project comparison, precisely because it demonstrates so clearly what can be found once researchers start actively looking for connections between projects that were never designed to talk to each other in the first place. If uncovering how easily a hidden connection this significant can sit undetected inside already studied history is the kind of thing that fascinates you, that's really the broader lesson worth carrying away from this discovery, well beyond the specifics of these 3 particular empires. Every excavated tomb, every already sequenced genome, every dataset sitting quietly in an archive somewhere may still be holding connections nobody has thought to test for yet, simply waiting for the right comparison, the right cross-referenced database, the right question asked at the right moment to finally bring them into view. So the next time you read about 3 ancient empires as though they were entirely separate stories unfolding independently across different regions with no meaningful connection between their ruling families, it's worth remembering that the written record was never the whole story to begin with. It was written by people recording exactly what they wanted remembered and quietly leaving out whatever complicated details didn't serve the story they were building for future generations to inherit unquestioned. The bones buried inside 3 separate sets of royal tombs, it turns out, have been quietly holding a very different, far more interconnected story all along. One that took thousands of years and a genuinely modern scientific breakthrough to finally bring back into the light.